Hello, so today I'll be making a book review of Albert Camus' The Fall, which was the last novel that he published before his tragic early death in a car accident. And this book was, Jean-Paul Sartre said that this book was one of his masterpieces. I don't know if I agree, but it's definitely a very, very interesting book. So the book is set in a bar called Mexico City in Amsterdam, and the whole book is basically this long monologue of this one person in this bar who is telling this to a person, but the person who's receiving this monologue is silent the whole time, so it actually feels like we are there in the bar ourselves and listening to this man talking. The man is basically ranting about his life, and I'll get into it later in the book. But this rant really, and this monologue of just one person talking reminds me a lot of Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, and I think this was a big inspiration for Camus for this book. So, and from this rant we find out that this person has, is living a miserable life. Just the fact that he's in this bar and he starts talking about himself and is giving his whole life story to some stranger is sort of an indication of that this person is not in a good state. So who is this person who starts to relate his whole life story to the stranger in the bar? He is a former Parisian lawyer, once very successful, and he describes himself as a very morally good person. Of course, being a lawyer, he defends victims. He sees himself as sort of a knight of justice, not only in his job but also outside. He describes helping blind people cross the street, and he gives alms to beggars, and once he was rewarded with the Legion of Honor, but then he says, no, I don't deserve it. So he is this very, he sees himself as a very good and morally uplifted person. So the fact that he's telling about all these positive and great qualities about himself is sort of an indicator that basically he is a narcissist. And this becomes more obvious the more he talks. He says, I've always considered myself more intelligent than anyone, as I told you, but also more sensitive and skilled, a crack shot, a peerless driver, the best lover. So here he just shows that he thinks of himself as this amazing guy, not just like in one realm of life, but in all. Successful with women, good job, career, intelligent, skilled, a good sportsman. And so he's a very vain and boasting man. He's completely self-absorbed. He says, I've had at least one great love, always with myself as its object. So, and he says this in relationship to all the lovers he's had in his life. So he sees himself as superior to other people, and also he has this desire to be superior. That's what he wants and strives for in life. He says, even in the minutiae of daily life, I needed to be above others. And this is a common metaphor that he uses, that he describes himself as being on the top of lofty peaks, or just being above everyone else in life, and being this uplifted realm of being this good moral person, handsome, successful with women, so just above everyone. And not only is he a narcissist, or perhaps these two are related, but he's also an indifferent man. He doesn't take anything serious, the least himself, and sort of sees this life as just this game to play. So he writes, I've never been able to believe deep inside that humans' affairs are a serious matter. And later on, which seems to me merely a musing and tedious game. So life for him is just a game, and he's just proceeding across the surface of life, not really getting emotionally involved in anything. And his main objective is basically escaping boredom, just trying to satisfy himself and make time pass by indulging in love affairs and sports and whatnot. So life is not serious, and he just describes himself as just playing roles, these empty roles. He says, I often changed parts, but the play was the same. So the play is life itself. This role-playing shows that it's just a facade. There's no emotional depth behind it. So he's a very shallow person. So the first part of this book is sort of describing this high elevation. He's on this height, and of course from the title The Fall, and from the state that he is in this bar ranting to the stranger about his life story, we see that something has happened. A fall from this high soaring upper decks must have occurred. And I think one of the great things with this book is Albert Camus builds up this tension, really elevating this person, and with an anticipation that something is going to happen that is gonna crack this whole facade. And one indication of this, which sort of builds up this anticipation in a great way, I think. So he describes a scene: when I could lead a blind man on the pavement after I'd helped him to cross, I used to raise my hat to him. Obviously this gesture was not intended for him, since he could not see it. So who was I addressing? The audience. After the performance, the bow. So this is a great indication that he is performing not so much for the benefit of the other person, because he was a blind man, but for his own self-satisfaction. That's why he raised his hat, but the man is blind, so it doesn't benefit him in any way. So it shows that he's doing it for himself, and just for the audience, as he says. And this audience is this sort of this, what he imagines other people see him as this good moral lawyer person. And another one of these instances as a crack in his facade of this good altruistic person is another scene. And it's a slip of tongue, actually. He says, a driver was thanking me for giving him directions, and I replied, no one would have done so much. Of course I meant anyone. So this slip of tongue, he was supposed to say, if someone thanks you, you say, oh, anyone would have done as much, you would have done the same in my position. But he says, no one would have done as much. And this sort of almost like a Freudian slip of tongue, saying that, which displays that he really, he sees himself as this morally high person, better than everyone else. No one would have done as much as I have done for you. Even if it's just giving directions to a taxi driver, he sees him as he sees himself as this exceptional person. So what is the fall? What is the big catastrophe that all these slips of tongues, these cracks in the facades are leading up to? So basically it relates to a specific event. He is out walking one evening, and it's a November night. There's this light rain. It's an hour past midnight. He's leaving the house of one of his mistresses, and he's walking across a bridge, and he sees this silhouette of a woman. He just observes it but doesn't pay too much attention to it. He continues walking, and then suddenly he hears a scream and a splash of water, and he realizes that the silhouette of this woman threw herself off the bridge to commit suicide. And he describes this sort of moment he freezes when he hears this. The ensuing silence seemed interminable, as though the midnight had stopped dead. I wanted to run, but could not move. So he's frozen on the spot. So, and the heroic thing for him to do, this good, moral, uplifted person, would be to, of course, jump in and save the woman. But he runs off. And this is the fall. His whole self-image of himself as a good, heroic person shatters because he doesn't save this woman. He just runs off like a coward. So after this scene in the book, the narrative really sort of stumbles down. All the facades are stripped away, and he behind him being a lawyer and why he was trying to be such a good person. And he says the reason why he wanted to see himself as such a good person and help others and being this moral superior person is that he was in fact this whole time trying to escape being judged. By putting up this perfect facade, his hollow inner would not be exposed. And he says really interesting things about the topic of being judged. He writes, "People hasten to judge so as to avoid being judged themselves," which I think is very true. And he writes later on, "Don't wait for the last judgment. It takes place every day." And also, "We need no help from God to create guilt or punishment. Our fellow man is enough." So the world this main character is living in is this world surrounded by judgment, constantly being judged, and that was what he was so afraid of. That's why he wanted so badly to create up this facade, and was to protect himself from being judged. And he describes this state before the fall, before the catastrophe, as very where he was sort of shielded from being judged by putting up this facade of being a good person. He says, "No judgment affected me. I was above the stage like a god." So this blissful state of not being judged. And he also writes later on, "I, free of responsibility, beyond judgment and punishment." So later on in the book, which I think is really interesting, he goes on to doing the opposite of what he did before. Instead of putting up this false image, he becomes obsessed with tearing it down, with showing other people what a miserable and bad person really is on the inside. He writes, "I wanted to destroy my flattering reputation, to free myself from the mannequin that I presented to the world." And this reminds me, I read somewhere where criminals before they are arrested are really, really anxious. They're always living in this constant worry about them being arrested, and when they being very worried of the potential of being arrested. And so once they are arrested, it's almost a relief, because they don't have to worry about, oh, what if I'm going to be arrested? They are arrested, so it's almost it's like a relief. And I think he's feeling the same way. He feels this moral reputation that he's built up around him becomes like a burden to always uplift. And the last sentence of the book is really interesting. He writes, "Young woman, throw yourself in the water so that I might have the opportunity to save us both again." And this really highlights that the woman's fall from the bridge, committing suicide, and him not being the good person that he thinks he is to save her, but him fleeing instead, is the fall, is what destroyed him. And so he's sort of wishing that she would jump in again so he could instead go and save her, and this would sort of save his self-image of himself, and he wouldn't have descended into this miserable spiral of masking himself and sitting in this bar and rambling and telling a story to a stranger.